Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and my guest this week is Leslie Temple Thurston. And actually, I'm her guest this week because I'm at her beautiful home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where my wife and I came to visit her sister, and so I decided to do a couple of interviews while I was in the area. I've been aware of Leslie for quite a few years now. I'm on your email list, actually. Yeah. And so I've been aware of what she has been up to, and I also listened to an interview recently that you did with Tami Simon on Insights at the Edge. And so when I heard your story, in fact I remember this interview very well. I was doing yoga asanas in my driveway in the sunlight and listening to an interview of you with Tami Simon. I thought, what an inspiring and fascinating story. I'd love to interview Leslie. So I put you on the list, and then when I discovered I was coming down this way, I thought, let's do it. So here we are. Leslie divides her time between Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Limpopo Province, South Africa, and I'm sure she'll be telling us about that during the interview. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
It's wonderful to be here with you. I'm honored that you wanted to come to Santa Fe and interview me. I don't do a lot of interviews. Actually, I'm quite reclusive, in fact, except for the work that we do. We haven't become activists or anything like that.
Right.
Just in a certain way when we work. I suppose working with the black people of Africa is kind of an activism. So.
And you work with animals also, yes. Elephants and lions.
Well, yes. We are supporters of an organization called the Global White Lion Protection Trust, because white lions are being used for canned hunting in South Africa, and a very good friend of ours named Linda Tucker has been drafted by Spirit to take care of these lions, and she has her own farm with her own lions where they roam free, but all around that area are farmers who are they're using white lions, they're breeding them and using them for canned hunting. Do you know what canned hunting is?
No. Is it like the lions can't really get very far and the hunters just come in there and they're like sitting ducks?
Yes, the lions are released into a fenced area, and then the hunters, I guess, either walk if they want to or safely drive in jeeps until they find them and they shoot them. And the farmers are making probably upwards of $40,000 a trophy.
Oh, I see.
So there's
so it's hard for them to resist.
It's people from Europe and America that are coming and doing it, and they need the money in that area, so they've succumbed.
Yeah.
And it feels just grossly cruel and awful.
Yeah.
And as far as the elephants go, the elephants of Africa are under siege. They're in trouble. They're wanting to cull them in South Africa. They say there are too many. But we're suspicious of that motive because it really doesn't seem as though there are too many. And in the rest of Africa, their great open spaces that they migrate through are being closed off and taken away.
Right.
So everywhere in Africa, these magnificent creatures are under threat. And they're so intelligent, and so they're like whales. They're the whales of the land. They're extraordinary, and so we're involved in doing what we can about that.
Well, that's one thing that kind of inspired me about you, is that you have this very profound spiritual dimension, which we'll be talking about, but you've kind of channeled that into compassionate activism for people and animals. And a lot of times you don't see that. A lot of times it's kind of one way or the other. I mean, I know people who are most probably spiritually awake from when you hear a description of their experience, but they like listening to Rush Limbaugh, and they're very, very conservative.
Really?
Yeah, I know. There's one guy I interviewed. You can listen to his interview on batgap.com.
But that's total illusion. How can you be awake and listen, other than just to get the drift of it?
Well, it's a good question. It's a whole interesting conundrum of spiritual people who. It's a whole chapter, I think, that we could get into, is the dichotomy, if there is one, between kind of inner awareness and having that percolate into the personality in such a way as to make a person, compassionate and generous and morally upstanding and so on, and very often even great famous spiritual teachers fall down in some of those respects. They may have tremendous darshan and radiance and so on, but then you hear stories of them sleeping with their disciples and doing weird things with money and so on. So I find it inspiring and a nice example to set if someone walks their talk, and
I don't see much point in being awake if you don't use it for the betterment of humanity. That's just my perception.
Yeah.
I think my position, I was going to say my problem, but my position was that I grew up under apartheid in South Africa, and I just saw too much of the upper class dominating the lower classes, and they're black people, the lower classes.
Right.
It was horrifying to me, even as a child. I couldn't bear it. The 30-odd years that I lived there were torture. It was so refreshing to come to the US. I breathed freedom. We had censorship and you couldn't say anything about the government, and people were put under house arrest and investigated. It was awful, and I went to a liberal university in Johannesburg, and so we were always, the campus was always being invaded and infiltrated, and we were always walking on the streets
by
the
government
secret
people?
police.
Oh, I see.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I remember
People.
watching that movie about Stephen Biko.
That was later.
Yeah,
The whole thing erupted just before I left. And the reason we left was obviously Spirit's guidance, but my ex-husband got an appointment at UCLA. He was a doctor, so we had already agreed to go when the whole thing erupted. But I realize now that my destiny was to not be there for when the actual revolution hit the skids, in a way.
Right.
And I was on my spiritual journey, and it wasn't that I was escaping, because I had been on my knees to my guides who were communicating with me at that time, and saying, what can one person do? What can I do? I have to do something. And so they sent me to the US. And it didn't make sense at first, but what happened was that I met a spiritual teacher, and several spiritual teachers, and I began my journey. Because they said, we'll show you what one person can do. And they took me through the whole journey very fast over the course of a few years. I had a cave experience where I was completely secluded for about 2 years, and that during that time I did a lot of process work to help South Africa, because the revolution in 1986 and 7 was at its height, and that's round about the time when people like Biko and others were being executed.
Now that's a good little synopsis. But now let's go back to the beginning and unpack that whole thing and go into the details of every stage.
Yes.
So maybe let's go way back. I mean, as a little girl, what was your first inkling of any sort of spiritual dimension or interest in that sort of thing?
Well, my grandparents had a farm way out in the bush that was really far away from everywhere. Actually sort of near the border of Botswana. It was very wild. And I used to get sent off there regularly during the school holidays, or offloaded by my parents to spend the 3-week vacation with my grandparents. And my grandmother was a strangely reticent person who didn't really like me very much, I don't think. But so she left me completely to my own devices. And so I would wander through the fields and through the bush hours and hours on my own, or else I'd go to the compound where the black people were, and I would hang out with them. And there was no electricity there, and no paved roads. And I was in the middle of Africa, and that's an energy field all of its own. And many years later, I realized that I was going into samadhi as a child, just wandering around on this farm with nobody to talk to and being left alone. I didn't understand, but I liked it. I was in this sort of wildly expanded trans-Africa state of consciousness. And then it was balanced out by my education and my life in the city. That's where it started. Because when I did finally break into samadhi when I was older, my mind immediately, my whole awareness went back to Africa, and I was right there again.
Yeah.
So I understood that I'd been doing it as a child. And then, of course, during my teenage years, I did what other teenagers
Just
do.
became a wild and crazy teenager.
Yeah. But I always carried the banner for the black people of Africa.
Did you
I
get
never-
flack for doing that from your
No, my
peers?
parents were quite liberal. They didn't mind at all.
How about friends at school? Did you befriend black kids? I guess you weren't in the same school as
You
black
know,
kids.
South Africa is the home of apartheid.
Yeah.
So it was major segregation.
Right.
We lived in neighborhoods where everyone spoke English, and the Afrikaners lived in a different part.
Yeah.
Mostly didn't live in Johannesburg. They had their own city or cities. So only more recently has there been a real intertwining of the different races and nationalities. But everyone was separate. The English-speaking people were much more liberal, and the Afrikaners were they were the
I see.
architects
Yeah,
of apartheid.
And so
I'm not pointing fingers. It
I know.
really was a complicated mess, and
It
now
is.
they're trying to fix it. So, and it's a sort of a noble attempt.
Well,
to fix
it seems like it turned out a lot better than it might have, you know. I mean, when Mandela came in, he was very forgiving. And,
Yes, it was a miracle that
yeah.
it wasn't a
I mean, he
bloodbath.
could have been a very bitter man, you know, after what he went through.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, he's a profound, unique being, and he gave his whole life for that.
Right.
And he and people like Bishop Tutu and so on really did save the country.
Yeah, I mean, the two of them seem like these bright spiritual lights, you know.
That Truth and Reconciliation Commission was profound. I wish they'd kept it going a bit longer. But I suppose there was a dharma to that. The people, Mandela, when he stepped aside a few years ago, said, okay, now it's up to you. You, the people, I can't do any more for you. You have to do this on your own. And they are making a pretty valiant attempt to get to know each other and live peacefully side by side.
Yeah.
After decades of hatred, that's really quite
It is.
something.
This is a tangent, and perhaps we shouldn't go too far down it, but I often get the feeling that really great leaders who come to the fore in trying times had a sort of a destiny to do that. It's almost as if they were sent, you know, or assigned by some higher power to be born at a certain time and go through certain experiences in order to arise on the world stage when they're most needed.
It's very, very clear.
Like people
to
like
me.
Abraham Lincoln, or you know, different people like
Yes. Mandela, I'm sure, is an ascended master who took an incarnation in
that. Very
order
well
to-
could be, yeah.
Because what we've come to understand in the aftermath of the ending of apartheid is that South Africa is holding something very important for the world, an attempt at reconciliation.
Yeah.
And racial mixing and homogenizing
I
themselves.
mean, if they can do it, then
Yes,
you know, anybody can.
absolutely. I mean, there are 11 different languages just amongst the black people, and then the whites they speak 2 different languages. So they have a lot of official languages, and the people who've been kept separated for so long don't just naturally gravitate towards one another. So it's taking effort.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the World Bank has stepped in, and that just sounded an alarm bell for me when I heard about that.
So let's get back to you. So you survived your teenage years,
Yes.
and then you know, coming out of that, which for me was a wild scene, but coming out of that, when did you first, you know, kind of revisit your spiritual nature? You know?
I remember 2 years when I turned 13. I started getting downloads And I began to realize that I saw things differently from the way other people did. And then again, when I was 18, I got a whole surge of downloads as well about transcendent experiences. And doorways opened, and I started being capable of having transcendent experiences.
Please elaborate on downloads, what you mean by that, and what some of these downloads were, and how you saw things differently.
When I was 13, I felt mystical alignments beginning to open in my awareness, and I was uncomfortable.
You kind of knew them as such. You knew what these were?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I did. I knew that I could see things that other people couldn't see.
Like what?
Oh, I could
Like auras
see,
and things like
yes,
that.
and I could see into them. I could see
Into
what they were
people,
thinking and what they were feeling, and I could read them very easily. And I had one girlfriend that I could share a little bit about that with. She was compassionate but couldn't join me there.
Yeah.
And so I kept quiet about it.
Did it kind of
And
spook people if you said something?
Yes, I became quiet and serious.
Yeah.
And then again when I was 18, when I started university, I had a whole period. It was probably astrological, but there was a whole period where everything opened up again. It had closed up a little bit between 13 and 18, then it opened up again. And I went to the university in Johannesburg and studied fine art. That's what I was drawn to do. And I was good. It was the one thing I was good at. I couldn't do anything else very well, but I could paint and draw and so on. So I felt like that was my destiny, and I really got into it. Even after I graduated, I started painting a lot, and I had, I think, 3 exhibitions before we left South Africa. And when we left South Africa, I didn't realize it, but that was the end of my painting career. We arrived in Santa Monica, California, and I had to take care of 2 small kids. I didn't have a nanny to do that anymore, so my painting time was gone.
Was your painting a kind of a spiritual practice for you?
Yes, I used to paint without copying things. I would just put a white canvas on the easel and stand there and then intuit to take a certain color and just start doing this, and it would become something.
Were they abstract paintings or more literal?
They were a mixture, sort of semi-abstract and semi-literal.
Like a landscape or something that would be kind of abstract.
Mystical-looking landscape,
Right.
yeah.
You didn't do that, did you?
I did,
Oh,
yes,
very nice.
yes.
That's beautiful. It looks like an angel or something.
Well, it's actually the etheric body and some of the
person?
other bodies, mine.
Of yours? Oh.
Spirit made me paint it when I was going through the awakening process so that I would remember.
Wow.
I would remember that was what I looked like on another level. That was what they wanted me to do.
And so as you were painting that, were you experiencing your etheric body with that degree of clarity?
They said to me, it took me 6 months to paint this because I was out of practice. But my guide said to me, we don't want you to touch the painting unless you're in samadhi.
Right.
And so I was starting to go into samadhi, and sometimes there would be, long several-week interludes between each samadhi episode. And so I would add a little more. But I was going inside myself and then transferring what I saw inside myself onto the canvas.
Yeah.
And the feeling level of that was accurately what I was experiencing. Yeah.
Now I have an understanding of what samadhi means, and probably most of our guests do, but what do you mean by the word in terms of your experience?
Well, it's been different. It's evolved over time. But back in those days, it looked very much like the painting in that there was this light pouring out of my body, white gold light.
With your eyes open, closed, didn't matter?
Exactly.
Right.
In fact, when they said I should paint the painting, I'd been sitting on the couch doing the samadhi for quite some time.
Just sitting there experiencing light pouring?
Hours. I mean, I spent 2 years sitting on the couch in meditation. That's what the cave experience was. And at some point they said, okay, now we want you to make a painting. I hadn't done one for years, so I went and got a canvas, and they said, now you're not to touch the painting unless you're in samadhi. So it took 6 months because there were intermittent samadhis.
Right.
But the reason I had to do that, one of the reasons was because they wanted me to be able to hold the samadhi while I was in motion.
Right.
And focusing, so I
Yeah.
wasn't sitting anymore. I was
Right.
standing up
Doing.
in samadhi and moving my arms and,
Yeah.
and thinking a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's a very intuitive process, there's not much thought happening when I paint.
Right.
When I used to paint, I don't paint anymore.
Now, you've alluded many times already to they, referring to guides.
Yes.
So let's talk about that a little
Who
bit.
they were.
Who they were, how you experienced
It was
them. and so on.
absolutely everyone that
And when
you
that
know
started
the name
also.
of. Yes.
Yeah.
During the course of that 2 years, I was taught by everybody.
Okay, now wait a minute. So the 2 years
The
w-
cave
of cave
experience,
experience,
yes.
was that like
That
before
was
you
the
got married, when you were
culmination-
still...
no.
Later on.
That was long after my divorce and after
Okay.
all many years of spiritual practice.
Uh-huh.
It was between 86 and 88.
Okay.
And I guess I'd sort of reached the climax. So I was drafted into a small apartment
Mm-hmm.
in West LA, which is an area I'd never lived before, where I knew absolutely nobody. And gradually, the beings that were tutoring me telepathically
Mm-hmm.
led me into going out of the house less and less and less until I was really housebound.
Yeah.
And then they started working with me. And I went through the dissolution of my entire ego, including all the negative stuff at the bottom. So I would lie in bed or on the floor, weeping, or it doesn't sound
Just
very...
experiencing all
Just
this
letting it all pass through.
catharsis stuff
Yeah.
going on.
And this was the latter end of it, because as the human imprint of the ego dissolved, so the samadhi started to come through. And so the training then shifted. But I was going at one point seesawing between high, luminous samadhis and then diving down into the muck again. And this would be like a week-long cycle.
I wonder if someone, more mundanely oriented would have just said you had manic depression or something.
Oh, absolutely. I was
Maybe you did in one
completely
sense.
isolated. Nobody came near me. Nobody knew where I was. Well, actually, my family. But they had moved to Phoenix, so nobody was knocking on my door.
Right.
I was really, all my friends had somehow vanished, and nobody knew where I was. I was completely incognito, locked up in this apartment.
Huh. So when you say these guides were communicating with you telepathically, was that like a voice in your head,
Yes.
or more subtle? Was there a visual component where you could actually see what they looked like, or was it more like just a voice coming saying something?
It was telepathic, at least clairaudience.
Yeah.
I was hearing it.
Would
in
they
my
sound
head.
like a human voice with different, like as with a particular accent, for
Sometimes,
instance, and
sometimes.
different voices, man's voice,
No
woman's
accents,
voice, or
no accents.
different genders, or just somehow in
Different, mostly masculine
Uh-huh.
guides, but occasionally. I had a many-month experience of the Divine Mother working with me, but that came right at the end. They were ascended masters. Sometimes they told me their names, sometimes they didn't.
And you would know they were an ascended master because they would say, "I'm an ascended master, and my name is so on." Babaji.
I'm Ramana Maharshi.
Ah.
Ramana Maharshi showed up one day and he said, "I've come to teach you for about 6 months, and you need to do what I ask you to do," which I did.
Interesting.
And that he was one of the last. I started going to Samadhi at the end of that. But Babaji was one of them, Yogananda at one time, a whole slew of ascended masters from Archangel Michael, several archangels, but Archangel Michael was a very prevalent guide. And gosh, I'm spacing on
And
the
were
name of some of the others.
were they all people? Or
Sometimes they didn't have names, and I would ask them. They said, "You don't know who we are, and we don't feel that you need to know. We don't feel the need to speak about it." So
that kind of answers the question I was going to ask, which was, were they just masters that we all may have read about in books, or were they just somehow out of the blue something that no one's ever heard of?
It was both. It was almost everybody that you've read about in books, and more beings that nobody's, ascended masters, and then with no names.
Yeah.
At least they didn't tell me. They were so compassionate and so loving and so always there, and it was 24 hours a day that I was in this transmission that came through. And so I didn't mind being alone. I wasn't really alone.
You weren't alone. Plenty of company. Sometimes when I hear people talk about these things, I'm skeptical, but for some reason with you, I don't feel skeptical.
It was
because some people use it as a sort of an ego boost thing. Oh yes, I am speaking with the Archangel Michael, and he's telling me to tell you this, and it seems a little hokey. But in your case,
No, Archangel Michael put me on a 3-week fast and wouldn't let me sleep. I had to sit cross-legged in front of my altar for 3 weeks. Well, I got during the day. I was actually in computer programming school, but every night for 3 weeks, I didn't sleep a wink, and he coached me, and that's when my heart opened after the end of those 3 weeks. I didn't eat or sleep for those 3 weeks.
So you actually came out of the apartment, went to a computer programming school?
Yes, and then sat up when I came back.
And then came back and meditated all night?
With him. He
with
was
literally
guiding.
No sleep for 3 weeks?
No sleep, no food, no sleep.
How did you feel during the day when you were
Just
back?
Fine.
You didn't feel hungry or tired or anything?
Because I was being fed this energy.
Amazing.
Yes.
I feel like I'm missing a lot here, because there must have been so many interesting, particular things like that. That I mean, if you were communicating with all these different people, perhaps don't let us miss kind of the highlights of of all the...
Well, I can share something.
Yeah, please, as much as you...
At the end of those 3... I was sitting in a restaurant in Boulder, Colorado, eating lunch, and Archangel Michael, the voice came in and said, I am the Archangel Michael, and I've come to teach you. Do you want me to? Something like that. And I said, yes, I do. And he said, well, stop eating. And I had this delicious bowl of shrimp right in front of me that the waitress had just put in front of me. So I pushed it aside, and that was the beginning. I had no idea that it would last 3 weeks, and I had no idea what was going to happen, but I just trusted him. So I went to school every day, and I came home...
You were living in Boulder then?
In Boulder, yes. I came home, and I was living alone. I came home and was guided to sit down in front of my altar and meditate. And the first night was a bit shocking because it was the whole night and, no sleep.
Did your legs get tired sitting in?
Oh, that was part of the whole thing. My legs ached and my back ached, and it was agony.
Yeah.
And it went on for hours, and I just sat there and cried.
But you really felt like you shouldn't get up?
No. He had said he was going to teach me.
Yeah.
And so I stuck it out, and I didn't get up. But what happened was I just cried a lot because the pain was unbearable. And as I cried, my shadow started peeling off. He was peeling the shadow off. And it went on for 3 weeks. I didn't know that it would go on for 3 weeks.
So pain all night for 3 weeks.
But then after a few days of that, there was a night where I was just in samadhi bliss, and there was no pain. And the whole night felt like 5 minutes, whereas the painful nights just seemed like hours and hours of misery that dragged on. And I didn't know it would end at the 3-week mark, but I hung in with it.
Yeah.
I used to jog, so I stopped jogging, and he said, no, go and jog. You'll see, you'll be able to do it. And I did. I was able to jog my 3 miles.
Must have been good for your legs after all that sitting.
The pain would go away instantly, and it would arrive instantly. It was like the pain was being done to me, and just the crying was a healing. At the end of the 3 weeks, my heart opened to a much deeper level than it was. I mean, I was still very third dimensional at that point, but my heart opened into a higher dimensional state to the point where it never closed again. And he said to me at the end, he said, this is Heaven's Gate. And I can vouch for that being true. I had a whole different viewpoint, a whole different perspective on life at that point. I saw people differently. I felt different in myself.
How did you see people differently? What are some of the characteristics of this heart opening?
I could see their whole I could see their whole ego configuration and who they were beyond that. I mean, it was like everything became transparent. And I've
Just
never
would you
lost
have to
that.
sort of really zoom in on a person to see that, or could you just like
No.
at the cash register you see the whole picture of the
No, I didn't use it that way. These are people I knew.
right?
We were all in computer programming school together. And they were acquaintances, not
Yeah.
really close friends, but because I had lunch with them at times and I
Right.
spent time with them,
To be interacting and
I
focusing.
could see,
Yeah.
yes, I could see where they were wounded and where they were blocking the light and where they were in pain and so on.
Did you find yourself beginning to help them at that point?
In whatever
these
small
wounds
way I could without seeming to
Without
be.
imposing.
It was really just showing compassion
Yeah.
when people seemed to be suffering. There were times when I said, I see that you're in trouble, can I help you, or something like that. You
Yeah.
know? And then if they were really ripe, they would let me.
hmm
But it was just a way of being there for people, and I didn't want to. I didn't want to create the wrong impression. Let's say
Right.
that, and I just felt I need to be humble
Yeah.
rather than anything else.
I have a friend whom I interviewed earlier in this series who, you know, I don't know if this is still going on, but she went through a phase where if she was on the phone with a help desk at some company or something like that, she just to hear a few words from the person's voice and she'd start getting all this information. Oh, they went through a divorce and they have 3 kids and, you know, all these details of their lives just from the sound of their voice.
I sometimes get that kind of information, but really only if it's pertinent
Right.
to what the person's trying to clear in themselves, you know, or where their main hitch is
Yeah.
that's hanging up their lives. So yeah, it gets quite transparent.
So it sounds like your cave period happened in both LA and Boulder. Is that so?
The cave experience in LA came after the Boulder experience.
Oh, okay, I'm getting mixed
The
up.
heart opened and then I was sent off to the cave experience.
I
I
see.
was literally sent from Boulder to LA.
Okay. So you
As
had
soon
your-
as I finished my computer programming course.
Which you probably never did anything with.
No, but you know, I saw why I was doing it at some point, and that's why the samadhis started. Was because as an artist, I'd been very right-brained, and the computer programming balanced out
Yeah.
the left brain and the right brain.
I see.
And as soon as I started to get some mastery in the computer programming, that's when Archangel Michael showed up, and that's when I went through those 3 weeks, and that's when the samadhi would begin at night. I would, even after he left, I continued to sit in meditation all weekend and during my spare time, and often at night as well, and the samadhi started to come in at that time. So it developed over the course of quite a while. And then, you know, they sent me to LA at the end of the
Your guides.
programming course. Yes, they.
Yeah.
They're my telepathic teachers.
Had they sent you to do the computer programming in the first place?
Yes.
Right.
Oh, I struggled not to do it.
Huh.
I mean, they asked a few times and I would just go, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't have a mind for that. I'm not that kind of person, you know. But finally, somehow they cornered me. I can't quite remember how they did that, but they got me
Sign
there.
here.
Yeah.
I wonder if a lot of people have guides sort of whispering in their ear like this.
They do.
And
Everyone
they don't know
does.
it.
Absolutely.
Right. Or they
Yes.
just think it's some thought that's, you know, some random thing
They
going through.
do. Everybody does.
Huh. Is it always the big guys talking to them? Or are
No,
there like...
there are different levels of guides. I graduated from various beings to
Yeah.
other various beings.
So when you started out having guides talking to you, it was more sort of smaller, lower level, so to speak, in the hierarchy?
Well, there was a variety, because sometimes a really profound being would show up and I would get a real boost and move forward, and then there would be a team that would come in to try and hold me at that level. They would keep working with me to hold me at that level, and then when that level became established and I had maybe a bit of a respite in between where nobody showed up at all, but I was very committed to my meditation. I did that every day. So, but then someone else would show up, and you know, it was a series of jumps that I was given.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean I've been meditating for 42 years, and I've always I've never thought of it so much in terms of, some other entity of some kind intermediating or helping me, although I imagine that must be going on in some way. I've always just thought of it as this process I go through where my mind settles down, like in this nice deep state and come out again. But, you're kind of giving...
I had asked for enlightenment. I don't know that everybody does that. I had asked for that. And I said, I had stated, I'll do anything to have that state.
Right.
And I gave up many things that were deeply important to me in order, and became a very solitary being, living completely at the whim of these guides.
Yeah.
Get in your car and drive to such and such. I would do it.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was just listening to a Sufi teacher, Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, as I was driving up here in the car, and he was talking about how, these higher beings, they don't have the dense bodies that we have. And so they kind of need us in a way to be intermediaries here on Earth in order to help to bring light into the world and so on. So it's kind of this collaborative effort. And I imagine that when someone shows a willingness to cooperate, then,
that makes them so happy.
Yeah, then they say, okay, here we go. Here's somebody we could work with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You get a lot of attention when you are available like that.
Yeah. But I mean, a lot of people would probably listen to what you're saying and think, I'd love to have that going on in my life, but I seem to be kind of a lunkhead, I'm not in tune with guides. I mean, I'm doing my yoga and I'm doing my meditation, but I seem stuck and I'm not making very much progress. And how could I have what Leslie is talking about?
Well, it's really, I suppose I had a destiny, but I'm not sure of that. I was very gung-ho. I've always had this activist heart. I wanted to see the world benefit, to see people benefit, and I was willing to make sacrifices, to sacrifice all kinds of things to do that. And so I'm not sure that I was special. I just had I had seen so much suffering that I just wasn't complacent, and I was willing to say, okay, I'm going to do what I can do to mitigate the suffering, not wait for somebody else to do it. Or I'd seen the need, that's a big piece of it. I'd really seen the need for compassion in the world. I'd seen such horrific things.
So to a great extent, your motivation for enlightenment was not, what's in it for me? I want to just experience all this bliss. It was, enlightenment will enable me to be a more useful servant of God.
I had no idea that it was bliss, to be quite honest. I wanted to serve.
Yeah, and you felt like your understanding was that enlightenment would be the tool or the attainment that would enable you to serve.
It wasn't my understanding.
Oh.
Remember, I'd said, I'll do whatever it takes, and my guides had sent me to the U.S.
Oh, I see.
And I'd been meditating before, for a year or two
just
in
kind
South
of on
Africa.
your own, just doing it.
I learned TM, and I did it on my own.
Okay.
Yeah. It was the only meditation that was available in South Africa.
Yeah.
So that was my beginning. TM was the beginning.
Did you have a good experience with that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I had lovely meditations. In fact, it changed my life. My whole perspective on everything changed. And
Peter Swan, remember him? South Africa, TM teacher. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, the one that I studied with was different. I'm spacing on his name right now.
It doesn't matter.
It was very important for me. I started experiencing transcendence very quickly.
With TM?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I knew this, it was the only thing I wanted to do at a certain point, and I didn't want the rest of my life. It took a while because I had 2 children at that point. It took a while for my husband and I to sort out, what was brewing between us. And finally we separated. And after about a year, I was asked by my guides to let my children go with him. And that was when I moved into the towards the cave experience. Which I couldn't have done.
That must have been, talk about sacrifices.
That was a big one.
Yeah.
And the art, I sacrificed the art. They stopped me from painting at a certain point. And They mitigated the separation from my children in amazing ways. I had a strong energetic connection to them.
To the children?
Yes.
Yes. So you didn't feel so separated?
No, and we talked on the phone. They were the only ones who ever got through on the telephone during the cave experience. For everybody else, the phone was kind of broken. It didn't always work.
How are they doing now?
They're doing fine.
Good. Have they, this could be tangential, but have they gotten bitten by the spiritual bug themselves? Or?
My daughter is to a certain extent, but in a different kind of way. She's going the academic route. She's doing a PhD right now. Not my son, no. He's more like his father. But no, they have lives.
Sure. So you did TM for a couple of years, and in South Africa, and then you were called to move to the U.S. You moved to the U.S. with your husband, did you?
Yes, and my children, all four of us.
So did you feel like the guides were instrumental in getting the whole family over?
Absolutely.
But the husband didn't. I mean, did you talk to him in those terms? You said, hey, honey, the guides say we're moving to L.A.
They arranged it. What happened was that he had just trained as an orthopedic surgeon, and lo and behold, the university, his professor at the university was contacted by the professor of orthopedics at UCLA, looking for a research fellow to come and do a 2-year stint. And the professor at the university in Johannesburg just went straight to my husband and said, "This is for you." So he took it.
But from your perspective, that was orchestrated.
Well, I didn't realize at the time. I wasn't that connected to guides that much during those days. Not until I actually began a serious spiritual journey did they start really running my life,
right?
Which I let them do.
Yeah.
But they asked me to let my children go with my husband when we got to that point.
So 2 years in South Africa meditating, then moved to UCLA. Family's still together, and then at some stage of the game there, the serious spiritual journey began to kick in. Was that sort of like simultaneous with or subsequent to your marriage beginning to break up?
It was simultaneous.
Simultaneous. So it's like the spiritual engines were revving up, and that was making it more and more difficult to maintain the status quo that you had been living.
There's another way that I look at it now, because it's happened many times, that I was evolving at a much faster rate than he was. I mean, his life is very much the same as it always was now. And I was on a very different trajectory. And so it was inevitable that we would move apart because he wanted stability and to stay the same, and I was already in motion.
Right.
And there was no way I was going to stop that.
At times, did you try to sort of sublimate your spiritual motivations to to keep the marriage together, or did you have a hard time compromising like that?
I did a little bit, but really not with any gusto or
So there's
seriousness.
such a force to your evolutionary drive that you really couldn't.
Well, at first I thought I could be married and a mother and do a spiritual path, and then it became clearer that I couldn't.
It works for some people.
Yes.
It does.
Well, I was waiting for him to move with me, and he didn't. He didn't come, and I finally thought, I'm going on my own now. I have to go on my own. And
there's a Bengali saying, if no one comes on your call, then go ahead alone.
Yes, that's what happened. It was painful. It was heartbreaking, actually. But
you felt confident that you were doing the right thing. It was sort of like...
It was all intuitive. I was never that confident, but I just...
Trusted your intuition.
I did. I guess I could feel that I had to, that I had no choice.
Yeah.
I had no idea where I was going.
Right.
But I was, by the time you've let go of your career, your husband, and your children, you don't have a lot holding you. And I was just ready for takeoff at that point.
How old were you at that stage, if you don't mind my asking?
He and I separated when I was about 35, I guess.
Okay.
So, and I woke up when I was 42, so it was that period in there.
You reached this stage at which you were reaching escape velocity because of the spiritual urge that was welling up within you, or that you were also receiving from your guides. And then you said something about a 6-year period before the cave period started. Is that right?
That was when I studied with 2 spiritual teachers for about 4 years.
Is that worth talking about? I mean, I'm sure it is. It's probably. What did you go through?
Oh, the one was a woman, a Jungian, and she introduced me to the notion of shadow.
Oh, very.
So it is important to talk about that. She made it very clear to me, and I knew she was speaking the truth, that if you don't deal with your negative ego, which is your shadow stuff, you can't wake up. You can't really you can't dissolve the ego unless you deal with the stuff that's down there. And that made perfect sense to me. I knew she was speaking the truth. So she was very clear. You can't just go into the light all the time. You're not. That's just the upper reaches of the ego when you do that.
If a person tries to do that, what happens to them?
They just get stuck.
Does the negative stuff sort of keep jumping out?
It does.
At inconvenient times?
It does, yes. Well, there are people who can use their wills and stay above it. They don't
keep it bottled up.
Keep it bottled up, yeah. And so, for whatever reason, I chose to believe her, and for 4 years she worked one-on-one with me, dissolving all of my programming. You know, we
in a sort of a therapeutic setting.
Yes, a one-on-one
just talking.
Right. She was a seer, though. She could see. Okay, you've got this program, and you know it's now up at the top of the list for you to dissolve. So we would dialogue about this particular behavior or ego program, and then I would surrender it, and then it would go away. And we did a lot of that.
And it probably was not totally smooth as silk, surrendering all this stuff.
No.
I mean, you must have been going through a lot of purging of...
This was right as my marriage was breaking up, that when I met her. And so I was really ripe and ready. At this point, I had let go. We just hadn't quite separated, but we were living very separate lives at that point. And so I was fairly distraught. It wasn't a very cool experience having a marriage breakup. It was hard. And I was distraught and a bit confused and so on. But it was as though I was being carried along by the current in a river, actually. Anyway, she was there, and I started to see all the places where I was locked in and stuck and so on, and it became quite consuming. And then it was shortly after, maybe 6 months after I'd been working with her, that I met Rama and started sitting at his weekly meditation sessions, and which I did for give or take 4 years, I think. Although the 4th year, I still considered myself to be students of both of them, but they
Were
both...
you still seeing the woman?
Well,
periodically.
Periodically, she lived in L.A. and Rama at that point lived in Boston, and I lived in Boulder. So as that was
very
when,
handy.
yes. So I still believed that I was affiliated to them, but in actuality, my inner guides were weaning me away from them and moving me into this sort of full-time telepathic tutoring that they were giving me.
How could you do weekly meditations with Rama if you were in Boulder and he was in Boston? Were you flying to Boston?
Well, that was before we all left LA.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So in other words, Rama was in LA at that point.
At that time, and then he went to Boston and I was in Boulder.
I see.
So it wasn't, it was just in my mind that I studied with him for 4 years. The actual experience was probably more like 3.
I have a friend who was really into Rama, and he said that he actually saw him levitate and stuff like that. Did you see that? Anything?
Yes, we used to go out into the desert and he would do stuff. I watched him disappear. He was sitting on a rock in front of me and I watched him just dematerialize.
And you could see stuff behind him that had been there.
The rock that was behind him.
And levitating?
I didn't see the levitating, no.
Interesting.
But
and everybody in the audience saw it? It wasn't just...
Not everybody, many people.
So it sort of depended upon your receptivity to see that?
I think so. I think the mind gets in the way and just disbelieves.
Yeah.
But
interesting story, that whole guy, but that's a whole other story, and he's not around to interview anymore.
No, he's not. He was an interesting person.
Yeah.
But as I said, I didn't study there with him for more than about 3 years.
So you were shifting kind of into not having a human teacher, but just having, this telepathic thing.
That was the direction that it went, and
Yeah.
eventually I had no human teacher.
Yeah. And so that's when you began to enter your cave period in Boulder.
Yes. That 3-week period in Boulder was obviously a preparation, because my heart was open at that point and I was very, very receptive. And that's when I was put into seclusion.
Yeah.
And in that apartment that I called my cave, it was very much like a cave, actually, the apartment itself, sort of dark and cave-like. But and at the end of that, I had a number of breakthrough experiences.
In the 3 weeks?
No.
In the 2 years?
The 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's hear about those.
Well, there were stages, once again, like the period with Archangel Michael, when I sat on the floor and meditated all night. That was a stage. That was a significant stage. It had a beginning, a middle, and an ending, with an outcome where a significant change had taken place.
And once the change had taken place, it was sort of like a permanent shift.
Yes. Oh, I was a different person after that. And
saw the world with new eyes.
My whole reality had changed.
And then it would change again, and then again.
Exactly. Right. So the whole cave experience was a series of those shifts that ignited or initiated a different perception and consciousness. And I finally figured out that I was actually shifting dimensions. Maybe not all of them were dimensions
of consciousness?
Yes.
Right. I'm glad you're saying this, because a lot of people have a shift and it'll be very profound and they'll think, that's it, I'm done, I'm enlightened. And my notion, my sense of things is that there are many, many such shifts to go through, and there may be no end to it, as far as I know. There are significant milestones.
I don't think there's an end to it.
No.
Because I'm still working and shifting, working on myself.
And I don't know anybody who isn't, and
That's how especially now. And it's possible that, a couple hundred years ago, when the world was moving more slowly, the vibration was slower, that there was a sense of reaching a goal. But this whole planet is in accelerated evolution right now. And so people who are actually doing a spiritual evolutionary journey by choice are moving by leaps and bounds, and this is the great opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
So, no, I would never try to put a ceiling on anything.
So I kind of distracted you a little bit, but you were saying during those 2 years there were a number of significant milestones.
There were significant doorways that led to a whole new level of consciousness.
Perhaps you could just sort of sketch out each of one of the more significant ones briefly. Or not briefly, if you want to elaborate.
The one where we discussed the making of this painting was a very significant one, because I started going into samadhi, and I had been having samadhi sitting on the couch, but I had to keep very still, stop my mind, and hold the meditation in order for that to come through. And then, so the painting was significant because I got up. They wanted me to be able to walk around and move and be functional, and hold the samadhi at the same time. And their rationale was, well, painting is something you know how to do, so we think that you'll be able to do this.
As opposed to fixing an engine or something.
Right, yes, yes, where I had to engage my mind.
Yeah.
You know, the painting was very intuitively
And
spontaneous.
so by samadhi in this instance, do you mean sort of a settling into a state of unbounded awareness
Yes,
with very
no
very
thought,
little or no
but
thought,
heightened perception.
heightened perception, and being
And
able to maintain that while painting?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So that was a tutoring that had an outcome, and gosh, there were others I can't quite remember. I can't bring them
Mhm.
back right now. So maybe we should move on.
Sure. So, shall we move on to the end of the 2 years?
Oh yes, at the end of the 2
Yeah.
years, that was the most significant
Okay.
one of all.
Yeah.
At the end of the 2 years, I didn't know it was the end of the 2 years.
I figured there must
but,
be something special at the end of the 2 years, or
Yes,
otherwise it
I
might have
know,
been 3
that's-
years or
of
4
course.
years.
Obviously.
Yeah.
I had gone through a period of shadow that was fairly regular, but one day I was sort of sitting on the couch, which I did most of the time, and I was feeling sort of strange. I couldn't really define it, but I had a vision, and this was very clear even with my eyes open, that a lot of arms materialized. It sounds so bizarre, but these arms with hands came down in front of me and grabbed me, and I felt myself being lifted up, and then I don't remember anything. I went. I don't know. I only found out what happened later under hypnosis, but I was gone for 3 days.
Really? Your body was on the couch.
I don't know
Oh.
where my body was.
Okay.
I came to on the couch in the same, lotus position, and was very disoriented.
And you looked at a watch or something to figure out that it had been 3 days?
No, fortunately I had a subscription to the LA Times, and when I opened my front door, I was sort of bumbling around in this sort of dazed state when I got off the couch. I opened my front door and there was a little pile of newspapers there. So
see how many days had
yeah,
elapsed.
so I knew how many days had elapsed,
Huh.
but I was gone.
Huh.
And the thing that was most noticeable at the end of that was my state of consciousness. That I knew I was in a nirvikalpa samadhi at that point. And
Better define that for people.
I don't know if I can. It's
Meaning
a
it didn't end.
vast,
Right.
transcendental state
Right.
that didn't ever go away. I'd had those high samadhis before, but then they would subside and I would plunge into the shadow again.
Yeah.
But this stayed. I didn't go down into the shadow anymore. I just stayed in the state.
Of
And
course, initially you probably didn't know that you were going to stay in that state. You might have figured that you were going to drop down, but then...
I did. That's why I didn't tell anybody.
Right.
I didn't go
But
out
then
and
days
say,
passed and you
"Yay,
weren't
I'm
dropping
finished."
down.
Yeah. The days went months.
Yeah.
Actually, I didn't tell anybody for 2 years because I wanted to be absolutely certain.
Did you have friends that you could talk to this stuff about? Did people know what you were going through all this time?
No.
You were just on your own.
I waited 2 years, then I wrote my ex-husband a letter and told him, because he knew what I was trying to do. He didn't really approve of it, but he actually paid my rent, so
that's
he was
nice.
supporting me. Yeah.
Did he think that, well, again, I feel like I'm getting tangential here, but I'm curious, did he think that there was any legitimacy to what you were striving for, or did he just think you were nutty?
No, I think he, over the course of all the years that I'd been meditating and sort of asserting my independence around this, that he kind of half believed it.
Yeah.
He was clear it wasn't for him, but he was
Right.
willing to.
And you weren't doing anything crazy.
No, I wasn't
you
doing
were-
anything crazy.
you were-
He saw that I was
Yeah.
serious. I think he may have thought I was a bit
You weren't shaving your
barking
head.
up the wrong tree or something,
Right.
but he was willing to humor me, I
Okay,
guess.
well, that's very nice.
So I waited 2 years before I ever told anybody
Yeah.
anything. But the seclusion started breaking up at that
Right.
point. And people started coming into my life. Like there were several people who lived in the building with the block of apartments that I lived in, who came and knocked on my door and said, "We've heard that you teach meditation. Will you teach us meditation?" And so that was sort of a coming out thing.
Yeah.
And then I met a couple of other people at some kind of festival, some kind of Whole Earth festival, and they wanted to come and meditate with me. And so my seclusion was over, and it sort of one thing led to another, and I started teaching them what I knew aside from the meditation. But I want to share with you about the when I went to the woman to be hypnotized.
Okay.
I got this inner guidance.
I'm
that
surprised you could be hypnotized once you're in a state of nirvikalpa samadhi. That I just think you wouldn't be.
You're so, I guess, open that it's very easy
flexible.
and can surrender into it.
All right. Well, I'll let you
So-
tell the story. Maybe.
I don't know if this part was just made up. I don't think so. I wouldn't be telling you if I really thought that. But I went to this woman and on the guidance to do it, and I relived under hypnosis the whole experience that I had had during those 3 days.
I see. So
I knew
it
what
was
had
revealed to you
happened.
what was going on in
Yes,
those 3 days. All right.
yes, yes.
Can we
It's
tell us?
kind of bizarre and amazing.
Sorry.
After being lifted up, which I guess was a sort of an etheric thing, nobody really lifted my body.
Right.
Don't think my body left
People
that
would have seen it on the
couch.
couch if they peeked through your window or something, probably.
I don't know.
You really don't know, but
I have
probably.
no idea. I never went to the bathroom. I never regained consciousness
Yeah.
for those 3 days. So the first thing that came up in the hypnosis was that I found myself in what was like an operating room, the big light above my head, and I got the sense that I was on a craft, a spacecraft.
Right. I was going to ask you that question. So keep
And
going.
there were beings around me that were very compassionate and loving, but they were doing a kind of a surgery on me. And I remember the one said to me, "Don't be worried, don't be afraid. But we want you to know that you will never be the same again after this." Okay. I just remember this huge light above my head, and that I've been in operating rooms before, so I could feel it had that kind of feeling. And there were a lot of tubes and pipes and things hanging from some kind of mechanism on the ceiling, and they were hanging kind of above me and around me. And it was a sort of a cold metallic kind of white light in the room that resembled an operating room. And then the scene changed, and I was being held. A group of 7 gigantic beings were all held their hands together. They were in a circle, held their hands together, and I was like a tiny little Thumbelina sitting in the palm of their hands. And they said to me, "We are the Elohim. And each one of us, each one of the 7 of us contains a universe, 7 universes, 7 Elohim." And they held me like this, like little Thumbelina, and they spoke to me. I don't really quite recall all of what they said to me, but after a while, they all lifted their hand. They invited me to look inside each one of them and see the 7 universes that they contained. And I remember doing that and finding the 7 universes being totally different.
Were they like universes at different levels, or were they more like each one a universe
They were-
full of
because
galaxies like we see in NASA photos?
Because they were in a circle around me, and I looked from one to the other around the circle, they were all on the same level. There
Right.
was not a hierarchy there
But you
at
say
all.
each one was totally different.
Each one was totally different, and I'm afraid that I cannot recall the details. It was as though I was looking at the structure of consciousness as it manifested its particular form of life inside each of those universes. And because I was doing that with my human orientation, I couldn't retain, because they were so different.
Yeah.
Different forms of life.
So
Yeah.
in other words, it was so alien to human intelligence that it's impossible to sort of recall it and express it in
Precisely.
English language.
Yes,
kind of thing.
precisely.
Yeah.
And that took a certain length of time. And the Elohim said to me, "You are one of us."
Huh.
And
Elohim is just a sort of a celestial
Well,
being or something, right?
I didn't really
Is that what that means?
know. I didn't really know.
But that's what they call themselves.
Well, there are creator beings, angelic creator beings.
I see.
I've since learned,
Mhm.
but they seem to each, I don't know how many of them, I only saw those 7,
Right.
and each one contained a universe.
Now you kind of segued from being in apparently in a spacecraft of some kind
Just was
to this
like
Elohim thing. Or
Just like a dissolution, just
They're
suddenly the scene.
two different scenes.
The scene faded, and then,
And then
I
this
was,
one started. Okay.
yes. And then the next thing that happened was they said some words to me which I can't recall, but then they had me look up,
Mhm.
and what I saw was something very much like that scene from the movie Contact,
Mm.
where she goes through the
Yeah.
time warp and she sees that golden galaxy
Mm.
with sort of golden light all around it, and she looks at it.
Mhm.
Well, that was what, this was before the movie Contact was
Right.
made even, but that's what I saw.
Mm.
They all held their hands up like that and pointed me towards this.
Mhm.
And I and actually held their hands so that their hands went right into the golden energy around this spherical golden form, and I felt the energy of it. And whenever I watch that movie Contact, somebody
I have
else
to
has
see that
been
again.
there.
It's been years since I saw it.
Somebody else has been there, because that was exactly how
Yeah.
I felt. You know, she goes, "Oh my God, it's so beautiful."
Either that or the
That,
intelligence of these beings channeled that into the
Channeled
movie
that,
makers,
yeah.
you know, and gave them the vision to do it.
Yes. It was a saturation of love that I had never ever experienced
Mm.
before, and it was sort of, oh my God, you know,
Yeah.
kind of feeling. And I saw there was a slight pull in my body to just go right into that light, and something held me back, and I realized that it wasn't my time to do that.
In other words, you might have died if you'd gone into
I
it.
think I probably would have. That I came back because I still had
Yeah.
to do things and
Right.
live a life, and then I think that was the end.
Hmm. And
That
then you
was
woke
the
up on the
end.
couch.
Yes, I woke up on the couch.
Yeah.
And you know, if it hadn't been for the newspapers, I would have had no sense of the passing of time at all.
Right. Huh. And so then you began to get drawn out by people, teach me meditation.
Yes,
and
yes. There's the knocking on
do
the
this
door, and you know,
Yeah.
saying, you know, come. I guess I was luminous at that point.
Just to look at you, you mean people would think,
Yeah.
whoa.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there was a force field around my body. Now, I
Mhm.
don't have that quite to the same extent. At least I don't think so.
Oh, you look
It
pretty
may have
luminous to
just
me.
it may have just seemed that way
Yeah.
then, because it was so unusual. I'd never quite felt that way before.
Mm.
And now I've become accustomed to it, but I don't think so. I don't walk around, I don't have a huge golden aura around my body anymore. And I think that that's also evolutionary, and I've
Integrated.
integrated it into what's more like clear light
Mhm.
state of consciousness than that kind of radiant
Celestial
samadhi.
luminous
Yes,
thing.
my understanding of that is that that's still egoic, somewhat egoic. It's sort of a fourth dimensional heavens and hells. You're in the heavens when you're in that state.
But it has a polar opposite.
It's still
Yeah.
some of the hell worlds are polarities to it. Yeah.
I meant to ask, as a result of this whole experience you had, do you have any comments or insights into the role that sort of extraterrestrial intelligences might be playing in this whole thing? I mean, you know, a lot of people feel that they have a spiritual orientation and that they're assisting the planet in its
Yes.
spiritual evolution.
Well, what is an extraterrestrial? We think they're like little space people, but you know, the Ascended Masters are extraterrestrials.
But they do seem
And-
to, some of them at least seem to have physical craft that people see and
Yes.
that come around, and there's
Yes.
crop circles and there's all this stuff going on.
Yes.
And you wonder
Yes.
about, you'd like to think that they are benign and you know, have our best interests in mind, and maybe some of them do,
I've
some of
never
them don't.
really been into
Yeah.
spacecraft. I mean, other than going into one in that experience that
Yeah.
where I went through that sort of psychic surgery, that was definitely a spacecraft. But
Yeah.
and I'd never had an experience like that before.
I had another friend who had an experience like that. He was drawn up in a spacecraft, and he was shown these sort of instruments and everything, and then he was shown how that they're able to kind of monitor the levels of consciousness of countries and cities and individuals, and sort of do things to kind of help everybody along.
I'm quite certain that
Yeah.
they do. I've come into a perception that I would describe now as that we are like test tube babies, the human race, and that the higher beings are just like training, cultivating, teaching, developing us. It was a vision I had at one point. So they're right here. We are not alone. Because we have a programming to feel separate, that we perceive ourselves to be alone. After the fall, humanity became locked into the egoic veils of separation.
Yeah. Now, do you feel that these beneficent beings that you've been, you know, guided by most of your life, have a negative counterpart that are trying to hurt people or lead people astray, and that are in kind of competition with the good guys?
Well, that's what I've heard.
I mean,
I've
but
never
you don't
run
have that in
into.
your
I've never
experience.
run into any of them, but you know, my whole perception of reality was based on polarity, on the duality. One of the ways that I came into non-duality was by working with dualities. So I would imagine it's a question of whether there's still duality out there in space, or if it's confined to planet Earth, or if that sort of outer space thing is just an extension of our reality. So then there would
Well, I'm
be-
not just talking about like UFO type beings, but I'm talking about, you know, just as you have the archangels and so on, the Elohim and
They're
beautiful
demonic beings.
that you, yeah, right, and whether all a lot of the suffering and difficulties we see in the world are perhaps the handiwork of those more negative beings, and that these positive beings are in competition with them in a sense, trying to, through people like you and spiritual people in general, trying to kind of create enough spiritual energy to change the balance. I'm speculating, but I'm wondering whether from your experience you have more insight into that.
I think it's all part of our process in a way. The whole thing is like stage sets for our growth and development. I mean, it may sound a bit sort of egocentric to think that we're so important, but I do think we are.
Yeah. I think it can be given an egotistical slant. I mean, people have said, "Oh, human beings are so important; we can just rape the planet, you know, and take all the resources we want because we're the top of the heap." But that's not the sense in which you
We
mean
aren't
it.
the top of the heap at all. The thing that I'm getting on this is that we're the babies, and so we're being nurtured. And it's the process itself is about undoing the fall, undoing the state of separation that humans believe they're living in right now, that there is no separation.
Right.
But we do have these veils around us, illusory veils of separation, that are there as part of our evolution in this patriarchal age. I don't think we've always had those veils. In the previous age, there weren't those veils of separation. But this is a cultivating of a whole race of beings in an evolutionary cycle. It's very carefully orchestrated. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
There's nothing random about anything that happens. And it's just the human state of separation that perceives the randomness.
Yeah.
Because
Oh,
our
right.
separation is our sense of separation is feeling, allows us to feel cut off from things
Yeah.
and disconnected
Mhm.
from things, and it's an illusion.
Yeah.
There's nothing random, and there's no such thing as separation. And so that's what we wake up to.
Mhm.
We wake up to the unity of everything, and that's what we're being taught. My experience with my guides was that they gave everything, all their time and energy, and absolute meticulous attention to detail in the way they worked with me.
Yeah.
There was nothing shoddy or slipshod or, part-time about it at
Very
all.
serious work.
A very serious work,
Yeah.
yes. The evolution of the human race we're
Mhm.
talking about.
Yeah. And as you were saying that, I was kind of picturing a leaf falling from a tree and thinking, every little tiny thing like that is perfectly integrated into the whole divine plan, or the whole divine play.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Nothing goes on. There's nothing that's. I mean, if you think about it, everybody says, "Oh, yeah, God is omniscient." Well, if God is omniscient,
Nobody really knows what that means.
But if you think about what it means that every little housefly and every little particle of everything is permeated by divine intelligence. So how can anything be random
No.
or arbitrary?
And of course we don't see it that way. So that's our learning curve,
Right.
is to come to that.
Hmm.
And time is not an issue. We've got all the time in the cosmos to be
Yeah.
able to make the journey. And some people are further along, and some, it's like a one-room schoolroom where some people are just beginning and others are very developed. But we learn through our experience of being cut off from that divine light, from the separation that we live in. And so, as I said, I think we're like test tube babies.
Yeah. There's a T.S. Eliot line about somehow, I forget how it goes exactly, but somehow coming back home to where we started from and discovering the place for the first time. Somehow it seems like the whole cycle of going out into diversity is necessary to forge a greater wholeness.
Well, we have when we're in that state of separation and we're trying different diversities. Each one is calibrated to teach us a set of lessons.
Yeah.
So each soul comes in with a slightly different configuration. Each life, they choose a little different configuration. They're not into wholeness yet. They have to have that specialized configuration in order to have a certain set of experiences.
Right.
And when they've had those experiences and they're done, the next life they'll come in with another configuration.
Another lesson, set
And
of
it's,
lessons.
you can't really learn lessons except by separating things out. Because eventually when there's no separation, everything, the wholeness is there and there's nothing further to learn.
Right.
So we are learning through our state of separation, and
Yeah.
that's very, very profound, actually.
And you referred to it as a fall, but that sort of has a negative connotation. But
Well,
really,
it
without
wasn't.
having, pardon? Go ahead.
It's an illusion that
Right.
there was a fall.
Yeah.
And it wasn't an accident. And we
Right.
treat it like a disaster.
Yeah.
That's why I called it the fall. People's egos feel very ashamed and broken by that separation. If they ever dig deep enough to see that's the cause of their pain, that's what they'll see. The loss of that divine connection is the most painful thing we can experience. So when that's healed, we are... we're whole again, and that's
Right.
the whole journey through this earthly system.
And if the loss is the most painful thing we can experience, then the restoration must be the most sublime thing we can experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But most souls, they start looking for that reconnection in personal relationships or
Right.
having a lot of money to assuage the pain of the emptiness inside. And of course,
Doesn't do it for
doesn't
them.
do it. So
And
how
one
many
thing leads
lives
to
do
the
you
next.
have to have before you realize it's not going to do it for you?
Yeah.
You want the real thing. But you have to realize that that's the missing piece first.
Funny how Coca-Cola picked up on that slogan. It's the real thing, somebody intuitive in the Coke company. Did you feel that these the beings that have been guiding you are multitasking. In other words, Archangel Michael and so on, he's not just focusing on Leslie, he must have a lot of clients, so to speak, that he's working with.
They're not singular beings, you know, they're like... But I've experienced my own multiple bodies in the work that I seem to do at night with people, you know. I can't remember all of them, the memory cannot...
In other words, while you're sleeping, you're out doing something.
I've got many bodies that are out doing things simultaneously. And, you know, Archangel Michael's like a everywhere at once being. You know.
Right, omniscient, or to a degree or whatever.
Yeah, yes.
So in other words, he might be working with everyone on the planet, or a certain set of people on the planet simultaneously with the same care and attention that he gave you.
Yes, yes, yes. And this sort of singularity that we live in our little bodies is what we think to be reality.
Right.
It's not at all.
Before we started taping, you and I were talking about the political scene and what we each thought of that, and whether we were optimistic or pessimistic or whatever. Do you feel? I mean, you said earlier that you feel like there's a kind of a divine plan. I'm not sure if that's the word you used, but that there's a kind of a destiny, or whatever words you were saying, that everything, we're being shepherded along in this by this sort of loving intelligence. Doesn't that kind of make you optimistic, despite all the apparent tragedies and difficulties in the world, that somehow we're going to prevail?
Well, I have moments when I think it, and I think the moments that I was about to describe are based on my perception that suddenly, you know, we're gaining ground, and then something comes along and suddenly, you know, we're not gaining ground anymore. So I fluctuate. I wouldn't even call it pessimism and optimism. I think it's a clear perception day to day of the actual fluctuations of whether we are approaching a critical mass. And I think that there are people that are so deluded about everything that they're sort of messing up, you know. They're messing up for themselves and other people.
Yeah, I mean the environment and the
yes.
way animals are treated and the way people are treated.
Look at what's
just all this.
happening in this country, and I think it's happening in other Western countries too. Einstein said that if you keep doing the same thing in a hope of getting a different result, that's a kind of insanity.
Right.
Well, I think that's what's happening. There are people who are trying to do the same old, but at a much stronger, more vigorous level in the hopes of getting a different outcome. And to me, what that looks like is that they're verging on insanity. They are deluding themselves, and that could crash the whole thing. So people have to change, and that's the hardest thing for the average person to do, because you have to go through a process of reorganizing the egoic structure of the personality in order to change. We can use our wills to change a little bit, but often we just slide back again because the will is just a human will, which is a polarized, dualistic will, and so it doesn't have complete control over everything. And only when we come into a state of oneness can our wills really create real change. And you have to be willing to change to get to the oneness. It's kind of a double bind.
So let's say somebody's listening to this and they think, well, that sounds great. I want to do it. What do I do?
The first thing you do is make a statement to the universe, because everybody's listening anyway. You ignore the fact that you feel alone and separate, and you make a big, bold statement to the universe, to the more or less the way you just said. I really want to do this. I'm signing up, and you really have to mean it, because when the guides do show up and say, okay, well, we want you to change your life in this and this and this direction, you can't suddenly say, well, no, I don't think I can do that.
Yeah.
And then the agreement is off at that point. You have to be able to let them guide you and show
So would
you the
you
way.
recommend that people go out to a mountainside or sit in their meditation room or something and actually make an audible statement of intention? That
Yes.
This is what I want?
But you have to
With
really
sincerity?
want it.
Yeah.
Yes, you have to really want it.
Mhm.
If you really, really want it and you make a sincere statement and you say something like, I'll do anything,
Mhm.
I'll do anything that's necessary to end my state of separation, to transcend my ego, to come into whatever unity consciousness, whatever you think you need to do.
Do you think it would be wise to put in the proviso that I will do this as, in a way that doesn't hurt other people, you know, that doesn't sort of break someone's heart or leave someone abandoned? Or
I suppose you could.
Because some people get kind of selfish about spiritual advancement. You know, they'll you know, trample over in order to, you know, get ahead or something.
Well, that's just the ego
Yeah.
doing its usual ambition thing.
Right.
It's not really quite surrender. We're talking about a real surrender to the unknown. Not, okay, now my ego's going to start running the spiritual journey the way it's orchestrated my business or you know, my life or my marriage or whatever. It's, I'm here with absolutely no plan at all, except I know that I need to offer myself to this work because it's the only thing that's going to shift the global consciousness or whatever. Not I wish to be a high and mighty enlightened person. I think there has to be an altruistic genuineness to that surrender where you're really saying, I don't know how to solve the world's problems, but I would like to try, and I'm asking higher intelligence to show me the way. I think one has to have altruistic intentions to become enlightened. I don't think you can say, well, I'd like to be enlightened. And because I think what will happen is that the ego will short-circuit the process at some point.
Yeah, and if we think about what enlightenment means, I mean, by definition, it's sort of not a self-aggrandizement. It's not like me. I'm going to be great. You know, it's more of a, you know, a merging with something much vaster than our individuality.
But that's what people don't get. You know, they think it's going to make them, I don't know, more powerful,
super guru.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Because I know the projections that I get from people, students, you know, people who sit with me, is that I'm something special, that I'm, and that I know it. You know that and their projection of the superior makes themselves inferior, and so then we have a hierarchical projection that's really uncomfortable for me.
And then they're thinking, maybe I could become something special too, and then I'll have people sitting at my feet.
Exactly. So I see things with very equal eyes. Because I just see God in everything, and there's only oneness there. So these egoic perceptions of being special are really uncomfortable to me. I just wish I could somehow, I mean, I can talk about it, and I do, I try to explain it, but until the ego is dissolved to a huge extent, there's still that whole superior, inferior perception in the ego. And they think I'm being, you know, putting myself on a pedestal, and I'm just trying to help them see there are no pedestals, you know. And that what people don't realize is that it's coming from inside. It's a programmed or conditioned perception of superior and inferior, and we do that with all of society. It's a human perception that comes from inside. And then we tend to think that, oh, that person thinks they're superior. But actually, we're making them superior with our projection. And only when you come into the oneness and you transcend the duality can you see that it's all God, and there are no separations, and there's no high-low.
Somebody sent me an email about this the other day after listening to one of the interviews. They said, you know, why are you always quoting Ramana Maharshi or Nisargadatta or all these people? Aren't you sort of putting them on a pedestal? And, you know, can't you just quote yourself or whatever? And my attitude is that it's one of these paradox things where, you know, on the one hand, I feel like there are people who are vastly more advanced than I am, and I look up to them, and I respect them, and I admire them, and I'll quote them, and you know, I'm not taking what they say as some kind of gospel truth cut in stone that I need to sort of believe in, or else I'm going to hell or something. But you know, a lot of people have the ability to express it much better than I do, and you know, they're much more eloquent, and they can sit for an hour and give a beautiful lecture that I wouldn't be capable of giving, and I love listening to them, and so on. So there's no harm. On the other hand, I realize that essentially we're all the same and we're all one, and I don't know. So somehow these two things seem to fit together okay for me. You know, I can have respect and admiration and even devotion for someone, and at the same time feel a kind of a camaraderie.
You know, it's probably because you don't feel very broken inside yourself. People who are more broken by their upbringing, their childhood, and so on, are more polarized in that way.
I've been there.
They feel,
you know,
okay.
I mean, I had an alcoholic father and a mother in a mental institution. I was very
years of meditation have evened you out.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I've gone through all sorts of fanatical phases. And you know.
I wish that everyone in the world was willing to look at their egoic constructs from a witnessing place where they can say, this is just my garment for this lifetime. It's not who I am. I'm not the ego.
Yeah.
That I am I'm divine presence taking in a human life and living in a polarized ego in order to learn lessons, but I'm not the ego, and I'm not the dualistic nature that I'm expressing here.
Yeah. It takes a while to see that. I mean, you know, someone hearing these words isn't necessarily going to be able to snap their fingers and just see it that way. You know, there's a maturation process, I think. I mean, getting back to our person who has gone into their meditation room and proclaimed their intention to be enlightened, you know, for the good of the world, then, you know, they might then think, well, what next? Now what do I do? You know, I've had this intention. And I mean, do you sort of feel confident that something's going to show up for them pretty quick after expressing that intention, or you know, do some people fumble around for a while?
No, I really do think something does show up, but they might be too scattered to catch it when it comes, and they miss the opportunity to grab a hold of it. They're preoccupied. They're too into being in control. That's a big one. This is my life, and I'm in control of it. I'm going to do it the way I want.
Yeah.
And enlightenment's a nice idea, but really I have to learn lessons about life through being a controller.
So it can take a while to dismantle all that stuff.
Yes. I was gung-ho already, but the 4 years that I spent with the Jungian therapist were so profound in that I really saw the games that the ego plays about power and so on. Power, fulfillment, you know, need and desire and all that sort of thing. I really began to see that I had them all.
Yeah.
And that they weren't really who I was. That came through so clearly. And that was a quantum leap forward. So incredibly freeing, really, to have that experience. I would recommend everyone get a really good Jungian therapist.
Yeah. Is this woman still practicing?
No, I think she's in her 80s at this point.
Huh.
But getting to know your ego. You know, everyone goes, oh, I want the light, I want the transcendence, it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
They have a taste of it maybe. And the real change takes place when you grapple with your ego. It makes all the difference, because you then see, this is a whole fabricated personality. It's not who I am. And plus, you can catch yourself when you start doing behaviors that are part of the ego. You go, oh, whoops, there's my little power-hungry side diving in here and wreaking havoc, you know. And so you stop doing it.
Yeah.
You drop it, you drop it. And you have to drop both sides of the polarity. You have to drop the negative and the positive. And that's where people get trapped. They want to keep the positive side and drop the negative side. But because you're moving from duality into non-duality, you have to be willing to drop the positive side as well, the positive side of the particular programmed behavior that
Yeah.
you're doing. And then the liberation comes so fast, it's truly amazing.
And dropping positive and negative doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a lukewarm blob that has no emotions.
No, you're becoming a transcendent being.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what- you're becoming your real self.
Right.
You're actually completing the whole ego journey for the life.
Because some people, have this notion of dropping the ego or losing the ego or dissolving the ego as being a sort of a loss of something beautiful and unique and individual, and the ego is some divine expression of God which is meant to exist, and that by destroying it you become kind of zombie-like or feelingless or lukewarm, neutral kind of personality-less entity. Perhaps you could elaborate
that certainly
on
hasn't
that
been my
notion.
experience.
Right.
I find I have a range of emotions and thoughts and capacities that are like quadrupled from what I had when I was in the ego. The ego is a limitation. You still have human qualities,
Yeah.
but you have a much wider vocabulary of potentials available to you. It's not like your humanness goes away. As long as I have a human body, I'm going to live a human life.
Yeah.
But
I mean, if someone says, Leslie, you turn your head.
Absolutely.
You don't answer the phone and say, this is nobody.
Oh, but I know the truth of who I am is nobody in particular. And that in particular is kind of the key piece there, because I can access a very wide range of human thoughts, feelings, emotions, capacities, very empathetic, very aware. I can feel where people are at. I'm very sensitive to their suffering and so on. And so I feel like I'm a sort of a superhuman, really. I hesitate to use the term because it has sort of connotations
Right.
of Superman, but and it's not that at all.
Well,
It's just that I
the
have-
connotation might be is, hey, I'm special,
Yeah.
superhuman.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is, by virtue of having dissolved that kind of thinking,
I just have access.
yeah,
There's a whole lot more available to me. It's like Christmas time.
I mean, do you feel like there's sort of strata to your life, and on one level you're still Leslie Temple Thurston with your own personality and likes and dislikes and tastes and whatnot, and then as we go through the strata, we're moving toward the universal, there's this broad level, a vast, infinite level at which you're not Leslie Temple Thurston,
Some
you're a
days I'm
universal
not,
spirit,
yes.
but all these levels sort of they live together compatibly in order
They
to
do.
function as a human
They
being.
do, yes.
And maybe our attention sort of moves up and down the strata according to the circumstances and the needs. Does that sound right?
I think so, yes. I mean, I identify, I never changed my name. That was very clear from my guides that I wasn't to do that.
Yeah.
That I was to present the awakened state as a very human, ordinary kind of thing. So I was never guided to change my name or to try to live in an isolated ashram or anything like that. I mean, live here in the middle of suburban, middle-class Santa Fe.
I wouldn't exactly call it
And,
middle class, but maybe it is for Santa Fe.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, Shirley MacLaine or whatever her name is up in the hills living in the...
No, that's definitely different status.
Yeah.
I think Spirit had gifted us with this house, which sort of what happened, so that I could have space around my body,
Yeah.
because I'm hypersensitive, and so going into the marketplace like airports and that can really kind of makes me contract a bit. But no, I'm living a fully human life.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it to the hilt. It's very creative. I've always been creative, and I just love. I use my creativity in ways of helping people and writing and developing new theories and so on. rather than making paintings nowadays. But
Yeah. People are your canvas.
Mhm. In a way,
Yeah.
yes. If they let me be.
Sure.
And some do.
Yeah.
And life and the world seems very beautiful. I'm very concerned about the mentality of a certain group of people in this country.
Mhm.
I think that they are doing that that Einsteinian thing of
Yeah.
choosing to do the wrong thing
Right.
in the wrong way at the wrong time. It seems like they're going to hit a dead end,
Mhm.
and my concern is that they're going to hurt a lot of people along the way.
Yeah.
And
A lot of people are being hurt now,
yes,
and animals, and the environment, and all
I'm
kinds of
afraid
things.
so,
Yeah.
yes,
Huh.
it's hard. I'm very sensitive, and so
Yeah.
I mean I can weep for the suffering.
Mm.
I try not to be too
Dramatic.
gushy about it, but it does hurt me a lot.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I've had a very wonderful. It's been 20 years, or actually, it's 22 years.
Since the Nirvikalpa shift.
Yes, yes.
Uh-huh. So it's really Nirvi now. I mean, by meaning non-break. There has been no overshadowing or interruption or anything.
No.
During
Not
sleep
really.
also. I mean, is pure awareness there during your sleep?
I for part of the sleep.
Part of the
yes.
sleep.
Mm.
Yeah.
I go into a deep sleep where there seems to be no sense of anything
Mhm.
at the beginning of the night, and then I'm conscious for the rest of the night.
Yeah.
And we've been working so hard at that. We've been trying to get more
So rest.
restful sleep.
Working hard with court students and
Yes,
retreats and things like
and
that.
projects galore.
In terms of this
Activism,
humanitarian stuff we
yes,
mentioned in the beginning.
It's all activism
Yeah.
kind of projects.
Are you able to do it remotely from here, or do you have to go to Africa to do it?
Oh, we have projects here as well,
Oh.
so we're doing both. My role is more energetic,
Uh-huh.
although when we're in Africa, it's more hands-on
Yeah.
than it is here. But I am definitely doing an energetic piece of work for the world. I'm very conscious of it.
Elaborate on what you mean by that, just a little bit.
Well, it's really hard to
I think I
talk
know what you
about
mean, but
it.
I'd like you to try to.
Yes, I have a method of processing. So if I see a group of citizens or a country, they're all acting out egoic stuff. So whether it's a group of people doing egoic stuff or an individual or a whole country, it doesn't make any difference. I can process that internally because everything is part of me.
Yeah.
I'm
As if you sort of digest it or something,
yes.
and help
Recalibrate
to
it.
kind of
Recalibrate
neutralize it or
yes.
align it, recalibrate. Yeah.
But I get quite toxic physically toxic when I do that, and so there's a limit to how much I can.
And then
do.
you have to regenerate yourself to detox. Yeah.
Or it takes a few days for the toxicity to move through the body.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm quite down with it and try to keep going because I don't have time to
Yeah.
to rest.
Well, perhaps that's the main role you've been cultured for, because I mean it's a big world out there, 7 billion plus people, and there's only so many people you can interact with. But perhaps by working on this more subtle energetic level, you're able to have a much bigger impact than
Yes.
if you tried to just do it all on a kind of a
Yes.
one-to-one.
That is what's happening.
Yeah.
And that's increasing. Especially at night. I do most of it at night, but
During sleep, right? Yeah.
semi-sleep, whatever
Yeah.
you want to call it. But if I'm in the middle of something, it'll stretch out over a few days.
You mean if you're going through a process of,
Yes,
of
I'm going through a
realigning
process,
something, it might
yes.
take several days to do?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And are you usually aware specifically of what it is you're realigning? Like, okay, I'm working on this situation in Czech Republic or something like that?
Not always, interestingly enough. I mean, I would have to... it comes in at a very impersonal level, and I do it as though it was part of myself. So unless I happen to open the newspaper or my guidance actually says, this is what's happening, like the thing that I shared with you earlier,
Right.
that, it's a little bit of a danger signal. So they're alerting me to that.
So in other words, it's almost like you get assigned little projects. Instead of, hey Leslie, we've got one for you. We need this. We need somebody to work on this. Would you please take it on? And then you do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's, and I don't know if that's true for all people who are teachers or whatever. It's what, you remember that was my premise at the very beginning, I'll do whatever it takes
Yeah.
to help the world. And so that's what I've been given. I think it's different for other teachers,
I think so.
if they're making different choices.
And if they're constituted differently, I mean, we all have different nervous systems and different dharmas and different sort of functions. You know, an orchestra is composed of a lot of different instruments, and the
Yes.
flute can't play all the parts.
Absolutely. So not every teacher is there to do the same job.
Yeah, and some of them have big mass followings, like Amma, you know, and she sits there for hugging people for 24 hours, and others are just, you know, you might not even know about them. I mean, there might be people that don't have any students or anything, and
No, they are definitely.
they're just up in the mountains someplace
yeah,
or something and doing this processing thing that you do. Huh.
Yes, I'm sure that's true.
But on a mundane, practical level, if somebody wants to actually get involved with you and be taught by you or work with you or help you with your humanitarian things and all, you have ways for them to do that,
Yes.
obviously.
Yes.
Right. And there's a website, corelight.org, which we'll be linking to, and you have an email newsletter, and I'm sure that you can use donations for these humanitarian projects and helping them.
Oh yes, we're
Animals and all that.
always raising funds and seeking donations
Yeah.
for the projects, because the work that we do with the students doesn't cover that kind of stuff.
Right.
So that's why we're a non-profit. And,
Yeah.
and really, the teaching work just covers our staff, office, and household expenses.
Yeah.
Because we've always kept our prices really low. I didn't want to exclude anybody. So the work with the elephants and the lions and the AIDS orphans and so on is all funded by funders.
Does it say on your website, you know, what you're actually doing for the Lions and so on, so that if somebody wanted to make a donation, they could understand how their money was going to be applied?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay.
We've just been building a new website. I think that's what you're referring to.
Oh, okay.
And so some of those pieces aren't complete. The AIDS Orphans website, which is linked to ours, is under construction for a new one. We all needed a new website.
Yeah.
A bit overdue, actually.
Okay.
So that's under construction. I think the old one is still there, but
Corelight.org?
no, the
Oh, an
Seeds
older-
of Light. It's
Seeds of
called.
Light, okay.
Seeds of Light.
Is Corelight the new one?
No, Corelight is the parent
I
organization
see.
that does the spiritual
Okay.
teaching. We are a 501c3 organization. Seeds of Light is the name we gave to our African adventure,
Okay.
our African activism.
Well, we'll link to all these things
That'd be wonderful.
on the site, and people can come. And so, if somebody wants to study with you as a spiritual student, they don't have to come to Santa Fe, or do they?
No, we're doing everything on the internet, on phone bridges and.
So you give like conference calls.
Yes.
And,
The students are, we recently restructured everything because it was definitely called for. So we run a teacher training program, and the teacher training students formed into small circles where they get together on conference call and they process with each other once or twice a week. So that's something that happens without me having to be too involved in
Yeah.
it.
And then they teach others how to meditate or whatever they teach them.
It's a 4-year, the teacher training course is a 4-year course. And each of the classes has their own teacher. These are students from long ago that graduated, and I trust them and I know they're capable. So they work as the teachers. So I will work with very advanced students. We have an annual teacher training conference, and I run that. And we've just changed our MO over and over again over the years as people became more advanced, and we felt that the format needed to recognize the advancement and recognize people's skills and so on. And now everything we've arranged everything so that we get the most amount of talk out of the time available,
Good.
so that people are moving forward. And there are we do public phone conferences where Brad and I just ran one. It's actually still underway. It was, I think, 6 classes every 2 weeks on a Sunday afternoon on a conference call. And we've been looking at each week it's a different subject, like the environment, the situation with water, the financial potential, of what's wrong with the financial world right now, and the ecology.
And you sort of tie it all back to a spiritual dimension,
Yes.
and as opposed to the fragmented approaches that you can read in college if you want to.
We're in the business of shifting consciousness.
Right,
So
right.
we're connecting people's shifts to the global changes.
So you're kind of identifying how the financial situation or environmental situation all ties back to consciousness, and by how changing consciousness we can infuse more life into those things.
Yes. Changing consciousness,
Right.
that's what we're doing. But often what we saw happening is that people who change consciousness will isolate themselves into a bubble.
And become
where,
disinterested in all that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now,
Yeah.
more than ever, we have to see the mirror that the world is presenting us
Yeah.
of our own limitations.
Very good. Well, speaking of limitations, there's only so much capacity on this little thing that we're recording this with, and we've just about reached our 3-minute limit.
3-minute
So,
limit.
is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion in our remaining few minutes?
Oh gosh, all I can say is that discovering your heart and becoming empathetic and living in love, and showering that love in every direction, every opportunity you can possibly get, is really what's called for right now. And learning how to be unselfish and caring about others, because in this patriarchal era and in the Western world, we live so in our individuality. We've forgotten how to be a community. We don't know how to relate to each other. And that's going to be our downfall. The isolation of that individualistic state is where it's just me, mine, and I'm, living for my own whatever, maybe including my small nuclear family in the equation, but that's not how we're supposed to live. That's not how we're going to survive.
Yeah.
You build a fort by accumulating a fortune, and something will happen where your fort is going to be your jail. And we need each other. We need to love each other. We need to respect each other. That's really my message.
Good. Well, this has been really delightful, even more so than I thought it would be, and I thought it was going to be pretty delightful. So,
It's wonderful
I really
to spend this time with you.
I really enjoyed it. And I'll conclude, because we've reached about the end of our memory capacity here, but you've been listening to an interview with Leslie Temple Thurston on Buddha at the Gas Pump, one of a ongoing series of interviews with people who have had a spiritual awakening. And I hope you have enjoyed it. If you go to batgap.com, BATGAP, which is an acronym for Buddha at the Gas Pump, you'll see all the interviews that we've been doing and will continue to do, and then there's a little thing you can sign up for to be notified of new ones. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.